Good afternoon. Welcome to our program today. Our program is on racial inequality, and it is called Why Racism Matters to Jews. We are very fortunate to have not just the three panelists that I spoke about or were listed in our program, but we have also an additional panelist who is able to be here today. And I'm going to introduce everybody to give a context for what we'll be talking about. First of all, my name is Shari Berman, and I am the moderator for this program and the staff person at the Pozez JCC who works in adult education and put this program together. The people who will be involved today are Dr. LaNitra Berger, who is Senior Director, Office of Fellowships, Office of Undergraduate Education, George Mason University, and she is also an author. She often talks about the intersection of Black Jewish art, African and South African art, and has done a lot of seminars. We also have Dr. Charles Chavis, Assistant Director of Conflict Analysis and Resolution and History, and Director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice and Race, at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And he is also an author. And his background is on Black Jewish relations, the Black Jewish Alliance of the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s, from the start of the NAACP to Emmett Till's murder. And he is also working a lot on the minority communities in the States. Our third panelist is Rabbi Rabbi Saxe, affiliated with Temple Rodef Shalom. And he happens to be the staff person who is involved with racism, racial issues. He's doing a program on how to be an anti-racist with the congregation and delving into Jews of colors and their experience. And he is also involved with a group called Voice, which he'll talk about, doing a lot of interfaith work. And finally, we have Christie Jones. She is the Director of Community Engagement in the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice and Race at George Mason. And she is going to help me facilitate the program today, looking for your questions in the Q&A. And that's how we'll be taking questions today, in addition to the few that we've gotten from the registrations. And she's also going to speak when she feels she can give some well-deserved input. So as we start, I would like to have Dr. LaNitra Berger give a brief introduction about herself.
Thank you so much, Shari, for inviting me today to participate in this program. It's a real honor to be here and to be part of this discussion today. As Shari said, I am the Senior Director of Fellowships in the Office of Undergraduate Education at George Mason University, and I'm also affiliate faculty in the African and African American Studies program. And my research sits at the intersections of art and activism in the Black and Jewish diasporas. So I study the South African Jewish community, and I've just finished writing a book on Irma Stern, who's a German Jewish South African artist who painted images of Black women during apartheid. So much of my research surrounds the Jewish community and the process by which the Jewish community attempted to assimilate within South Africa during the apartheid era, and the discussions that they had in the community about how to protest racism and protest apartheid, while also trying to insulate themselves, since many of those community members had immigrated to South Africa fleeing violence and anti-Semitism in Europe and other places. And so my book really examines how artists like Irma Stern participated in those discussions and those debates and made critical decisions about how to manage the intersections between race and Jewish identity. I've also edited a book called Social Justice and International Education, Research, Practice, and Perspectives that brings together scholars to talk about the importance of social justice work in international education. And in this book, I've discussed the example of historically Black colleges having welcomed German Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 40s to teach at their institutions, and how these scholars were influential in not only training the next generation of architects and artists and scientists and other people, but they also inspired and compelled Black students to protest segregation and the racism that they were experiencing in the American South in the 1960s. And so I'm very much interested in these questions of how Black and Jewish communities unite against social injustices. And personally, I'm the daughter of two African-American people from the South. My parents came from South Carolina and Alabama. And in their discussions with me as a young child about their childhoods, the only times that they spoke fondly or positively about their childhoods were times when they interacted with people in Jewish communities. So my father gave a really great example when I was a child about having never been able to try on clothing at a store in his whole life unless they went to a store that was owned by a Jewish family in their community. And my mother attended Tennessee State University, where she studied math under one of the German Jewish faculty members at the institution. And so those examples really stuck with me and really drove me to pursue this type of research and to ask these kinds of questions, because I really believe that fundamentally Black and Jewish communities both have experienced lots of generational trauma over the centuries, and that has given both of them a unique perspective into what it feels like to be a stranger in a strange land and to speak up against injustice. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
All right. Am I
Dr. Chavis, thank you, Dr. Berger. Dr. Chavis, if you would speak now.
Yes, no problem. So yes, I'm Dr. Charles Chavis. I am assistant professor for conflict resolution and history in the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm also the director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race. And I'm extremely honored to be invited. I want to thank Shari and LaNitra for the invitation. As mentioned before, part of my research focuses on the history of the Black and Jewish Alliance during the early civil rights movement. The majority of scholarship concerning the Black and Jewish Alliance centers around what Bayard Rustin names as the classical phase of the civil rights movement in the United States, and that is the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And so my work speaks specifically to that earlier generation of rabbis and leaders, including more notable rabbis such as Rabbi Stephen Wise and others. And so, can you all hear me okay? I need to turn my mic up? We're good? Okay. My dissertation was originally on the interracial alliance of the 1930s and 40s in Baltimore. And within that, I recognized that, within this research, I recognized that there was one specific rabbi by the name of Rabbi Edward Israel, whose biography I'm actually currently working on. And he was one of the mentees of the more popular Rabbi Stephen Wise, and he was directly connected to the work of the NAACP as the Urban League, not only in Baltimore, Maryland, but also nationally as well. And I was really intrigued by the work that the interfaith work and interracial work that he had done in Baltimore, specifically the efforts that he led concerning combating and speaking out against racial terror lynchings that were beginning to reemerge briefly during the 1930s. And I was really intrigued to see his connection and partnership with the Black press and the Black community. He spoke in several Black churches and developed friendships with more notable figures, including Vernon Johns, as well as the eventual Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. I can go on and on about my research, but I was really intrigued by Dr. Israel, specifically as I reflected about the current moments that we find ourselves in, from Mother Emanuel to Tree of Life, and looking at the ways in which both, as Dr. Berger mentioned, both Blacks and Jews have been oppressed and targeted, specifically in this country. And so I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Christie, I know you're kind of in the background, but I thought maybe you'd say a word or two since you may answer a question. I thought it might be nice to just give a sense of what your area of interest is in working over at the John Mitchell program.
Yes, thank you so much. I wasn't expecting that. I'm a doctoral candidate with the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and an affiliate with the John Mitchell Jr. Program on History, Justice, and Race. I particularly work with Dr. Chavis on issues of peace and what peace is. My dissertation is going to be investigating the ideas of peace for Black Americans in the National Capital Region and investigating what their definitions of peace were and are in this moment. There's a lot of discussion about what it is to be peaceful, what it is to be free. And so my work is going to be specifically looking at those concepts amongst African Americans and those who identify as African American in this region. I came to the Carter School later. I'm an older doctoral student, but one of my most formative experiences was I worked for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for almost 4 years as their visitor programs coordinator, and had the joy and the privilege of watching the Holocaust Memorial Museum really become created and then later become the amazing and fantastic museum that it is now. I had the opportunity to spend time with Holocaust survivors and very much listen to their personal stories about what it is to endure and to survive the Holocaust. And the museum remains a personal place of pilgrimage for me to pay homage to many of those survivors who I knew who have now passed on. So for me, this is in some ways, it's a very personal issue. Having spent time at the Holocaust Museum and learning about the history of anti-Semitism, not only in Europe, but here in the United States. I'm deeply honored to be invited in this conversation and to be able to participate. So thank you.
You're welcome, Christie. We're glad to have you here, and good luck with your dissertation. Last but not least, I'm going to ask Rabbi Jeff Saxe to speak a little bit about himself, and I think he'll kick off the overarching question that we're going to be talking about today. And just to frame it, we're really talking about primarily in the United States, but why racism matters to Jews. I know we could talk about the world and Europe and all kinds of things where racism does exist or did exist, but we're going to just primarily focus on the United States. So when your thoughts and questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Christie will help make sure I get to see them. Thanks. Jeff?
Thank you, Shari, and thank you for putting this panel together. Yes, I will do my best to start us off on this very big and important question. I just want to say I'm also really honored to be on this panel with, listening to all of the work that the three of you are doing and the research you've done is very, very impressive, and I'm honored to be a part of this panel. I bring a different perspective as a congregational rabbi. I am one of the part of the clergy team at Temple Rodef Shalom, which is a pretty large congregation in Falls Church of about 1,800 families, so about 5,000 or so people. Overwhelmingly white in majority, but we do have some Jews of color in our congregation and some people of color who are members of our congregation, even if they may not be Jewish. We are on our own journey as a congregation to become better and more aware of how embracing we are of our own diversity as a congregation, and also in our relationship to and our awareness of our role as Jews within the story of racism in America. Our role in that historically, and also our role now in how we can be a part of addressing racism. So, our congregation has been involved for several years in discussions about race and about racism. Of course, since the death of George Floyd, we have had a desire to rekindle some of those discussions and start others anew. So I think that Shari mentioned we're going to be, we have a lot of people who are interested in taking part in discussions within the membership on this topic, especially using Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. This is just an example of a way that we're trying to address this, and looking at some internal assessment of how we're doing in making sure that all of our members are aware that that not all Jews are white, and that not all the members of our community are white, and also some of the other issues that I mentioned. We are also, as Shari mentioned, active in an interfaith social justice organization called Voice, which is Virginians Organized for Interfaith Community Engagement. It's community organizing, and it's an affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation. So it's an opportunity for us to partner with 55 or so other religious and other institutions in Northern Virginia. A diverse group. Within those are, of course, several primarily African-American churches, as well as masjids and other congregations. And it's so important as we do this work and as we try to become more aware, it's important for us to be in relationship with people of different faiths and different backgrounds. And that's one of the important things that, opportunities that Voice gives us. So why don't I try to start off this difficult question of why does racism matter to Jews? You know, in a sense, you know, it might seem like an obvious question, but it gives us an opportunity to begin to think about, you know, what are the basic beliefs and values of Judaism, and how do they come to bear on this topic? So, you know, the Torah commands, as we all know, the Torah commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves. The Torah also commands us, as a central Jewish tenet for so many of us, justice shall you pursue. With many specifics within that are also in the Torah, you know, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, about what that means, what justice means, and what does it mean to pursue justice. And they're about things like fair treatment of everyone in a society, respecting the dignity of each person, making sure that equal treatment is given. And I would just, you know, I don't want to dwell on these, but I'm happy to answer questions about these values, but I would just raise up also a central concept within Judaism from the story of creation in the book of Genesis, that every person is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And as Reformed Jews, we especially go back to this value all the time. Really, all streams of Judaism do. And they inform so much about how we want to act in the world. So the Torah also constantly reminds us that we are, so I've been going on for 6 minutes already, so I don't want to go on for too much longer. Let me just say quickly, the Torah constantly reminds us that we were once strangers in Egypt, and that we were once slaves. And many times we talk about how, because we are Jews, we know the experience of being refugees and of being slaves and of being the other. I think that, on the contrary, really the reason that we are reminded so many times by this in Torah and in liturgy is because it's hard for us to remember. And that as we get further throughout history from the experience in Egypt, from the experience of other times of oppression of Jews, like the pogroms, as we get further from the Holocaust, it's easier for Jews to forget that experience. And one of the main projects of Torah and of Judaism is to keep trying to bring us closer to the experience of being a persecuted people, so that we can relate to that experience, and so that we will do what needs to be done to fight things like racism and other forms of oppression. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rabbi Saxe, for those remarks. And I'd like to just pick up where you left off with that discussion, because I've been a part of the Jewish community in Fairfax since 2012, because my son went to preschool at the ECLC. And one thing that I always appreciated about the community was the welcoming nature of the community, but also the very strict adherence to Jewish values. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about that is the importance of questioning. Even this program is titled based on a question, and that the idea of questioning should be natural and should be taught to children from a very early age. And one of the reasons why I think that it allows the Jewish community to be able to be leaders disproportionately in almost every social movement that we've seen in modern history is because of the questioning. It's built into the Passover Seder. It's built into everything. And one of the most pernicious and insidious aspects of white supremacy and white privilege, which those two terms are connected, but we're talking more about white privilege right now, is that it goes unquestioned, that these are just things that are there and that you don't ask questions about them because you benefit from them and everyone should accept them. So I think that the idea of questioning is really important and is something that we need to encourage people as young as possible to explore, precisely because, as you said, we're getting further and further away from some of these events in terms of time, but in terms of the impact and in terms of the way that they shape our culture, they're still there. The Holocaust still defines much of what goes on in my household, being married to a man who's Polish Jewish. Lynching still defines the way that my family acts and behaves because of the scourge of lynching and the fear that this type of racial violence inflicts on individuals and on communities. And so it's very important that we continue to impart those values and those ideas on our children so that they don't forget.
Charles,
Yes, yeah. I just want to thank you so much, Rabbi Saxe and Dr. Berger. Yeah, I know I'm going to just go back to my area, which is with Rabbi Israel, and I spent so much time just researching him as a person and the decisions that went into taking a stance for speaking out against anti-Black racism whenever you had the rise of Nazi Germany that he was considering as well. And so having insight into his personal experiences and his evolution provides insight into the ways in which I think both Black and Jewish leaders in this moment can learn from this shared alliance that was really lesser known, as I mentioned, during the 1930s and 40s. And he always points back to, in his personal writings and his sermons, the importance of justice and how it is the center, like you said, of the Reformed tradition. And he points back to the Pittsburgh Platform, but he also points back to the arrival of Jews at the turn of the 20th century. When you look at the formation of the NAACP and the way in which that organization was formed, it was formed by both Blacks and Jews who were escaping the pogroms. And you had the rise of racial terror that was emerging during the period in which this organization was founded. It, of course, as we know, is the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. And so when we're looking at this specific movement, where we have Black Lives Matter that's emerging, it's important to understand the history of previous social movements and organizations that develop and are birthed out of these experiences of racial trauma and suffering. And I think that's so important for us to consider when we're considering the current phase of the larger freedom struggle that we find ourselves in today. What are the internal decisions that both Black and Jewish leaders have to make, specifically when both communities are still being targeted? And the thing I really respect and honor about Rabbi Israel's journey is that he was willing to critique members of his own congregation and of his own tradition, as well as members of the Black community, right? But he was always open to questioning, as both of you mentioned. And I think that's so essential in this day as well, because especially when you have so much work that's being done to divide and conquer both Blacks and Jews in this current freedom struggle that we're witnessing.
Terrific. Thank you so much for all of your answers towards this overarching question that the program is considering. So I think we've talked about it a little bit, but one of the questions that came up is somewhat of a pretty obvious one, but is anti-Semitism considered racism? Would we concur? Yes?
I'm happy to try to take a stab at that unless anyone else wants to jump in.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think it's a very complex and difficult question, partly because of the question that underlies it, which is, are Jews white? Of course, we have to remember as we address these questions that Jews come are of different colors, and so there's of course the independent question of the fact that that some within the Jewish community are victims of racism just by virtue of being Black or brown. The question of I think we have to look somewhat historically at anti-Semitism to answer that question, and the answer has not been the same at every point in history. Certainly, this is not the topic of today. I don't think we have any experts in the room on anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, but I think we know enough to say that there were, in my opinion, some racist elements, certainly, to the anti-Semitism in Germany, in that anti-Semitism came with an ideology that presented Jews as a separate race and an inferior race. So by definition, I think that is racist. And in the United States, I think it may be, although I'm not an expert in the history of anti-Semitism, I think we could say that that years ago, when Jews were kept from buying property, kept out of many clubs and living neighborhoods and universities, etc., that I would have to say there is a racial element to that. And now, as Jews have gained a different status in America, and I think we are perhaps in the process, those of us Jews who are white, of coming to terms with being white and what that means in terms of the relationship between us being a minority and sometimes a targeted minority, but on the other hand, being part of the white privileged group within America, that I would have to say now I don't view anti-Semitism as directly related to racism, because it's just a different, it's terrible and it's a big threat, but it's a different type of thing. If we talk about racism as I looked for some help in preparing for this to Ibram Kendi, because I love his definitions. And I don't know, there may be other ones that you want to bring up, but his definition of racism is that it's a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities. I don't think that anti-Semitism really is in any primary way leads to inequities between Jews and other people. And so therefore I wouldn't put it in the category of racism. I think it's a different quality of prejudice, and it's also a very complex process of that I won't go into right now.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Rabbi Saxe.
And I would add that part of the issue is that the common denominator between the two is white supremacy. And in the 1930s in Germany, one of the issues was that the Nazis were trying to separate Jews and define them as a race. And so you get into a lot of issues with, you know, is race biologically determined? Is it culturally determined? How do you really determine what race is? And, you know, in the middle of everything that we're going through right now, there's been some really interesting genetic research that's come out about, you know, the visible trauma that people experienced during slavery that can be seen in their genes. But we also see that, you know, a lot of things that we attribute to someone's race are not actually racially determined. So I think that it is a really interesting question, and I agree with Rabbi Saxe's interpretation of the question. But to me, where it gets tricky is how, when, at what points historically have we connected anti-Semitism and Jews with being a race? And even to a certain extent, how much Blackness is connected to a racial identity as well.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off that and say that, oh, so yeah, it's all about this hierarchy of human value, right? And that's where, LaNitra, you mentioned this in terms of the whole concept of white supremacy, right? And that's the way in which I understand the two, right? Both anti-Semitism and racism. It's all about, again, perpetuating this hierarchy of human value. And we've seen that happen throughout the globe, but specifically in America, we can definitely understand how that's played out systemically as it relates to systemic racism.
I'm going to add one other, I think, difference between anti-Semitism and racism. And I learned this largely from Eric Ward, who is another scholar who happens to be Black. He's a scholar of anti-Semitism, which is that I think whereas racism is a phenomenon that oppresses directly people of color, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy. It's primarily a conspiracy theory that is about Jews, and certainly it results in harm to Jews, but it is also, I think, perhaps primarily a means by those who are in power to keep down those who are out of power by creating a distrust of democracy and of those who are those who would of democratic processes and of government by blaming problems on Jews. And that can both have, of course, an effect on Jews because they may be targeted, but it also has an effect on vulnerable and on communities and those who are not in power by preventing them from having the impact on the democratic process that they could otherwise have.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for adding that last part and for all of your answers. We have a ton of questions coming in addition to the questions that we had prior to the program when I asked people to submit some questions. So I'm not 100% sure how we're going to get all of this covered, but I think we're going to go look in the chat at this point. So just bear with me a moment and I can get a question from the chat. Okay. This is an interesting question because it's going to talk more about what we can do. Where do conversations begin outside of the company or groups that already agree with you, especially without the confrontational behavior? What relationship does diversity have with our present day social environment?
Say just that last sentence again, Shari.
Sure, it was cut off. That's why I messed that up. So, oops, sorry. What relationship does diversity have with our present day social environment? And the question I think was, how do we have the conversation beyond just the groups of us that agree with each other? How do we take that one step further when it might get confrontational?
I'll let one of you begin.
Yeah, I can take this question. Dr. Chavis and I are both educators, so we teach classes, and part of our job as educators is to bring people together with disparate views and values into a classroom to discuss these questions and to discuss them civilly. And that's not easy. Unfortunately, the way that social media works and you know, the internet, it's very easy to continue to engage and read news that confirms what you think, and not read things that disagree or disconfirm what you think of. So you know, it's really important to push yourself and get out of these circles, so that you can be in environments where you learn from others. I think that, you know, in the Northern Virginia area in particular, where we're located, it's very segregated. So people tend to live in neighborhoods where there's not a lot of people who don't look like them, and that contributes to people living in echo chambers. And, you know, I know the Jewish Community Center is a place where I've really interacted with people who have very different values or views than I do, but it takes a lot of active work. Many of these communities, though, that people feel as though they're not, they don't have access to, are actually very open. Many Black churches welcome people who want to come and worship with them, for example. And those are great opportunities to see how other people worship and to meet people and see how they interact in their own spaces. So no one is saying that this work is easy, and no one is saying that, you know, one person interacting with somebody different from them for an evening is going to make any change. But it will certainly go a long way to start to understand how differently people see the world.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Berger. This is a comment that also has a question in it. And there was a question that was raised, and maybe in the poll that I did not launch, but might launch before we're all done here, about do Jews consider themselves white? And this question actually is related to it. It says, the acceptance of non-African American Jews as white has changed the Jewish experience in the United States, and to that extent changed the character of anti-Semitism. The panelists may be aware of a book entitled How Jews Became White Folks by Karen Brodkin. I'm not sure if you've heard of it or not, but so I think what they're asking is, and I'm not quite sure if it fits into this, do Jews consider themselves white? Do all Jews consider themselves white? And how does that play a role? Anyone want to field it?
So the question is, do all Jews consider themselves white? And how does that play a role?
Or most Jews, most Jews.
Right. So I'll speak to that. And of course, I'm speaking about white Jews, right? I mean, even though we're talking about the question of whether we consider ourselves white, I think the answer is of course different if you're talking about Jews who are people of color. So I believe, and I kind of touched on this, I think, a couple of minutes ago. There's a central part of Jewish identity, and I think that this is changing by the generation. So I'm already part of you know, an older generation, and as I was growing up, my sense of my Jewish identity, I think I did used to talk about it having a racial element, and that as a Jew, I was a part of a not only a religious group, but a people with a particular heritage and history of persecution. And in that sense, different from being white, because when I thought of what it meant to be white, that meant white and Christian. So at the same time, I do believe that I have always thought of myself as as white. If I had to answer the question, am I white or am I not white? Yes, I am white, and I never considered checking a different box in any application. However, I also did feel that I was a part of a different category of white people, and I wasn't the same as white Christians. And in a way that has been a point of, has made Jews feel perhaps, it's an expression of our identity, perhaps feel like a special and different group. And in a way, maybe that specialness is just in a form of recognizing the particular challenges that the Jewish people have faced. And that even though I grew up, and many white Jews, although not all, grew up in a place of economic privilege. At the same time, we also have had experiences, and certainly our close ancestors have had experiences of being the opposite. I have two of my four grandparents survived the Holocaust. They didn't go to camps, but they left Germany in 1938 to escape Hitler. And so I grew up hearing stories from my grandmother about that experience. And that has really been a big part of what connected me with my Jewish identity, and also connected me with a sense of having an experience, collective experience of being other than a majority. Even if it's not other than being white, it's other than being a part of the majority.
Thanks. And can I just add to that conversation? I think that the process of how whether or how Jews become white in any cultural context is fascinating. And I want to keep hammering home the understanding that much of this is driven by a white supremacist agenda. The idea of trying to make a group white or make them not white is all connected to white supremacy. And I studied this question and topic specifically in the context of the South African Jewish community, which, as I mentioned in my opening statement, it was a community of immigrants who had escaped anti-Semitism and pogroms and got to South Africa, which was a very racist and white supremacist environment. And at its peak, I think whites in general made up no more than 4 or 5% of the population. And so the government was trying to get more white people. And so when Jews first arrived, they were not considered to be white at all. They were very different, and they were separate from the white communities. But as the government decided that apartheid was how they would rule the country, they began making overtures to Jewish South Africans, allowing them to be white. And this caused the community to go through a lot of soul searching, because on the one hand, they despised and detested the means and the methods that the apartheid regime was using to gain power. But on the other, they were also interested in self-preservation and didn't want to expose themselves to additional anti-Semitic attacks. And in South Africa, being white meant accepting all of the privileges of whiteness, which meant that you had Black domestic workers, which meant that you always sat in white areas. And so this level of privilege made the community very uncomfortable, but they were constantly forced to choose between that discomfort and potentially being driven out of South Africa. So I think these are really interesting questions to think about. And I think that there's a lot that happened in South Africa that applies to what we're thinking about in the United States, just in terms of, how do you think about using your privilege, if you have any privilege at all, using that in the service of doing something positive to make change.
Absolutely. And if I could chime in real quick again to one of the congregants of Temple Rodef Shalom, whose name is Lisa, sent me a wonderful piece, which is from the book "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria" by Beverly Tatum. Mm-hmm. And she quotes a student on this question, and I'm just going to read a quick quote from somebody who I think really articulates the way many Jews might feel, who says, "I am constantly afraid that people will see my assertion of my Jewish identity as a denial of whiteness, as a way of escaping the acknowledgement of white privilege. I feel I am both part of and not part of whiteness. I'm struggling to be more aware of my white privilege, but I will not do so at the cost of having my Jewishness erased. I think that's an interesting articulation. I think it might capture the way many Jews feel about that question.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us, Rabbi Saxe. There are so many questions coming in to the chat. And maybe this one is a little related, so maybe we'll tackle it and then we'll tackle all the other issues of how we move forward. But this one is from somebody who talks about some of the books that are out there that have been, maybe touted to read so that we can understand better the situation, the historical situation, why there is racial inequality, and why people are very upset right now, and there is this huge awakening since George Floyd. Recent books like White Fragility argue that whites are all complicit in a racist structure. Excuse me, the chat is moving, so I apologize. And that the ideal of striving for a race-blind society is misguided. Is it possible any longer to honor Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of judging people by the context of their character? Kind of a heavy question.
Yeah, I think just based off of, my quick thoughts about the question, I think that it's in order for us to understand that, Dr. King's ideas of his so-called dream, if you will, oftentimes we focus on that one specific part, right? And we I guess assume or we hope, right, that he's talking about this colorblind society, but I don't think that's really what he meant, right? I think he was really he wanted to see equity and racial justice, right, which is much different from what's oftentimes attributed to him. And so I would be careful in terms of the ways in which we look at this current movement and what we're seeing as it being at odds with what Dr. King was hoping for and prophetically speaking of. If that makes any sense. So yeah, I guess Dr. Berger, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Dr. King wrote so prolifically on all of these issues, but that particular speech gets a lot of attention, and that particular line from the speech is really one that people tend to focus on a lot. I think that this is a both and situation. I think that it is absolutely possible that you can be a white person who benefits from a white supremacist structure and your white privilege. And I think you can be someone who also looks at the content of someone's character and really doesn't use race as a way to prejudge people. So I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that they actually go together. And the key to the second part is really understanding the first part. So as long as we continue to absorb the fact that white supremacy and white privilege is just innate and that we don't question it, it makes it very difficult for us to actually look at people as individuals and to be able to treat them equally.
Yeah, and I think we've had this similar question come up in previous discussions, specifically around anti-Black racism in the current moment that we're in. And, I always, tell the guests as well as attendees, we have to really be serious about the work of both narrative change and social transformation. And in this current moment, I've argued that we can't wait to do one and then the other, right? They both have to take place simultaneously because we're that far behind in terms of acting out and practicing justice and really dealing with the sins, if you will, of this country as it relates to systemic racism and the like. And so, yeah, I think that's really important for us to consider, that we need the narratives has to continue to change, but we can no longer wait for the transformation. And I think that's something that Dr. King is often overlooked in terms of the way in which we receive what Dr. King meant, right? A lot of what he speaks of, in terms of this whole idea of the promised land, right? Justice is in the promised land, and that needs to be understood. But the system has to change as well, right? And that's a longer process. And so, yeah, those are just, my quick thoughts about, the question, but I also think about the larger question, right? About what social transformation looks like and what narrative change looks like, and how part of this discussion, is definitely doing the work of narrative change. But at the end of the day, what are the tangible actions that are going to be done to right the prevailing wrongs?
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Also has come up quite a bit in here. How do we reignite the Jewish Black bloc or support for civil rights? And also, how will we do that in light of the fact that there are factions of some Blacks that are avowed anti-Semites? So how do we make that relationship stronger, knowing that there are some that would not like it to be necessarily stronger around the periphery?
Well, I guess I'll take the first stab at that. As a historian, I think it's I won't say interesting, but there's always been racism within, anti-Black racism within the Jewish community. There's always been, there's always been anti-Semitism within the Black community. And that's important for us to understand, right? And when we look at the current situation, the current issues in terms of it's mostly, we're speaking of the current split, I feel like, where you have the Black Power movement that emerges, which causes the alliance to dissolve, as some scholars highlight. But I think it's important to understand it in the historical context. Like there were always factions within both communities that didn't see the utility in sticking their necks out, if you will, for the community, right? And so in some cases, you had Blacks who felt like we're dealing with, specifically in terms of speaking out against Nazi Germany and Jewish persecution in America. They felt like we are dealing with racial terror here domestically. And if we're going to align ourselves with Jews, we're going to make ourselves a target. And Jews felt the same way in some cases in various communities, where they felt like sticking their necks out, if you will, for the Black community was going to fan the flames of anti-Semitism here in the US, right? And so those are real decisions that various communities had to make throughout time. And I think we need to understand that when we're looking at the current anti-Semitism that we're still seeing in terms of the Black community, as well as racism, if you will, in the Jewish community, which are real things that need to be discussed and dealt with, but they shouldn't stop the alliance from moving forward, because they've always been present and the work has always been able to continue irregardless of those various figures who decide to divide and conquer.
I think, if I can jump in real quick, I saw many questions bringing up the Deshaun Jackson issue recently with his Instagram posts, and some of the people who are asking questions are actually classmates and friends of mine. And we've had this conversation, and the reality, I think Dr. Chavis hit it spot on. There have always been, unfortunately, there has been anti-Semitism within various Black communities. Again, not painting anyone as a monolith. There have always been forms of racism within Jewish communities. Again, not making Jewish people a monolith. And I think in addressing some of the questions they talk about with this particular issue is the continuation of the conversation, right? The continuation of education, the continuation of showing where Black people in movements for freedom and Jewish people for movements for humanity and for freedom come together. I think one of the things that we certainly talk about and that I talk about in my class is about dehumanization. Racism and anti-Semitism are forms of dehumanization. They're trying to remove the humanity from the people in which we're talking about. And unfortunately, as oppressed and oftentimes marginalized, minoritized, dehumanized people, we often turn to other marginalized, oppressed, dehumanized people in order to express this anger, this feeling. And I think what we continue to have to do as people of thought, as people of consciousness, is engage in the conversations and educate people and refute those myths, refute those conspiracies, really be active in saying, not only am not complicit in this behavior, but this behavior is wrong.
Yeah.
And really being active in doing that and changing the conversations. So when you hear those kind of conspiracy theories about Jewish people, for me to turn around to my family members and say, I'm sorry, that is incorrect. Let me tell you how you're incorrect. And I think that is an important activity for us, again, as people of consciousness, to realize these are all forms of dehumanization. And the most important thing we can do is to give each other humanity.
Yeah, and I also want to be clear. I think I see this, how can I say it? I see a lot of this as distractions, right? I see this as distractions. And so in entertaining some of these radical theories, they need to be called out, right? Like Christie said, as conspiracy theories. They're not rooted in history or fact, right? And I think we spend too much time entertaining the words of figures who are, again, trying to divide the community. And at the end of the day, we know the work must continue, but I think this is a struggle, as I mentioned, that figures like Rabbi Israel, Dr. King, and others had as well, right? And so we have to understand that a lot of what we're seeing is nothing more than a distraction and the product of miseducation. Most of the people who we see who are spouting out, so I mentioned Deshaun Jackson and others, they have not studied the research. It's so much easier to, we call it armchair anthropology, right? Where you don't have to do the work, but you hear someone who is charismatic speaking and doing all this work, and you just hijack it, take it, and you spout it off as if it's true when you haven't done any research. I think some leaders in the Black community are now witnessing the importance of doing your own work and research and learning the history and actually asking questions specifically as it relates to the systemic oppression and the history of oppression in terms of the Jewish community. And I think it would benefit Jews as well who may find themselves on the fence and don't know much about the struggle that African Americans face in this country to sit down and have those conversations. But what I don't want us to do is to get distracted by these radical entities and forces that are attempting to divide and to stifle the work so much amazing work that's been done in the larger freedom struggle.
Yes, and as you both said, these are French ideas that are not grounded in any kind of research or direct experience. And the important thing to remember is that by and large, the Jewish community, as I said, in many of these modern social movements, has disproportionately been represented on the front lines of the freedom struggles. And when we remember that, we remember why that is and why it's so important that they are allies with us in the struggle and how we need to be allies in their struggle, that our struggles are linked and combined from here to the end of time.
Yeah, I just quickly want to, I agree with everything that's been said, and I want to underline Dr. Chavis's point, actually all the points that education is so important, because I feel that it's easy for many Jews to perhaps not understand the depth of racism. And I think it's also easy for many non-Jews and even many Jews to not fully appreciate the danger and the problem of anti-Semitism because of the fact that Jews tend to be in a privileged place in our society. And there's just not enough understanding of how deep and threatening anti-Semitism is.
Can I just give a personal example? One thing that I really appreciate about the Jewish Community Center and other Jewish organizations is that at Passover time, they have seders, and the seders are open to anybody who wants to attend. And for people on the call who are not Jewish, who have never heard of a Seder or participated in one, I think that that is an excellent opportunity, particularly for people of color, African Americans, who want to gain a better understanding of how slavery is discussed in Jewish culture. Attend a Seder. They're open, and in our family, this is one of the most important holidays in the Jewish religion, but also in our family because we are a Black Jewish family. And so it is the perfect time for us to meditate on what slavery is, why it is part of who we are as Black and Jewish people. And, I particularly enjoy the aspects of the Seder that discuss, what does slavery look like today, and how can we liberate ourselves from how we are enslaved today, both personally, professionally, religiously, politically. And I think that it's the idea that you spend several nights thinking about this every single year really does help promote this type of questioning and the ability to reach out to people across different cultures. So for me personally, Passover and the Seder is a really important time to think about how these two communities are bonded together over the issue of slavery.
I think for me, my personal experience, my first personal experience is really with anti-Semitism. And though I grew up in Europe, I grew up for a time in Belgium and experienced and saw it firsthand there. But it was working again with the Holocaust Memorial Museum and having the opportunity to speak directly with survivors. And one of the things that I always found astounding about Holocaust survivors is their ability to contextualize these issues of dehumanization. And in particular, I had really great friendships with the late Flora Singer and the late Frank Greenbaum. And my voice chokes up just thinking about them because they had tremendous influence on my life. And they helped me understand. They would sit and talk with me and educate me about the Holocaust and about anti-Semitism, and that it wasn't just these years of the Holocaust, that anti-Semitism is an ancient thing within human society. And what I asked Frank Greenbaum once was, so what do we do? And his response, I will never forget it, is have hope. Have hope. And it was so powerful for me because to see a man, to speak with a man who had experienced the horrors of horrors in a way that even myself as a well-educated Black woman had never experienced. Yes, I am the descendant of the enslaved, but I, am the daughter of a diplomat who lived a very privileged life in socioeconomics, educationally. And to have him still encourage me to have hope after seeing the horror of horrors, after being a survivor of Auschwitz, and for him to educate me, I think was so tremendously powerful. And I think there is a role for the Jewish community in making those links between this dehumanization. I think there's a real role for particularly Holocaust survivors, those that are still with us, to really help us understand, the younger generations, particularly those of us who are of color, to see what hatred looks like in lived experience. Holocaust survivors can tell us what it feels like to really feel hate in lived experience, much in the same way as there are African-American men who experience police brutality can talk about the hatred in their own lived experiences. And that is where we can come together and really talk about this writ large, not as racism or necessarily or anti-Semitism, but as hatred, as oppression, as dehumanization. And I think there needs to be more of that, more understanding of that. And for those of you who are on the call and are not of Jewish and who have not gone to the Holocaust Museum, I cannot stress that experience enough. I really encourage you to go if you don't know that much about the Holocaust, if you don't understand Semitism, if that's a new topic for you, I really encourage you to go to the museum and have that experience.
We have about 10 minutes left of this program, and it is amazing how quickly it has gone because we've had some terrific questions and some wonderful conversation and answers to some of the questions we've addressed. There are some questions that are coming up along the lines of maybe what Jews can do to be a little bit more enlightened to some of the history about Black oppression, as we are well aware of how we were oppressed both in Egypt and in Nazi Germany, and potentially in some other places too. Excuse me, I have a dog barking in the background. I'm going to make this quick and then I'll let you guys answer it. But how can we become less ignorant maybe about things that we don't know about the history of slavery in America? Also about Jim Crow laws. Maybe we've lived through some of that, but maybe not realized the whole impact that those laws have had generationally. Maybe going to, the African American Museum of History is something we could do. What else could we do so that we're comfortable and we understand the situation, how it's different or similar to ours? I love the idea that it's all hatred, because it really is. I mean, it's all the same in that respect, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism. But what can we do, and what can non-Jews do to learn more about the plight of Jews and how we are similar to each other and maybe come together again?
So this is a two-part response, because number one, we're still technically in a pandemic where a lot of things are closed and we can't go into museums in person. But as a person I teach museum studies and curating, one of the great aspects or silver linings to all of this is that many museums have changed their virtual offerings and made things much more accessible from the internet. And, a lot of the talk this summer has been about book clubs. Everybody's got a book club where they're reading, white privilege or how to be an anti-racist. So certainly, I always start from the position of what can I do right now with the resources that I have in the situation that I'm in. And so for many of us being quarantined or social distancing, that is going to mean doing some reading. If you have a lot of extra time this summer because of the quarantine and the pandemic, read as much as you possibly can and visit these museums online. Christie mentioned the Holocaust Museum, which has a wonderful, beautiful educational aspect of its website, as does the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we're lucky that our very own George Mason professor, Dr. Spencer Crew, is the director of that museum right now. And so, that's a great way to really start to inform yourself on the history of this country and how it has systematically exploited Black bodies for its benefit. I saw some people posting about podcasts that are good to listen to. This topic, it manifests itself in pretty much every sector that you can imagine. So you can't open up the newspaper right now and not read about someone who has started to speak out about the racial injustice that they've experienced in the fashion industry, in the sports industry. The people have been keeping quiet about all of this stuff, and we've all been experiencing this racism in the same way, and we just haven't been talking about it. So to start to do all that reading and really expand your mind so you can see the broad ways in which racism and white supremacy have touched our society is really important. I would also recommend that you support Black-owned bookstores. Many of them have gone online and have some fantastic programs where they're discussing many, many issues related to race and social justice. Haymarket Books and Labyrinth Books are two that have had some great events just recently. And now all of these are Zoom events like this one, and they're free. So I would say that that's something that you can do now, given the context that we're in. When things get back to a new normal, I would say that it's important to go in person and really visit these places. But then I would say that the next step is to really start to engage with people again directly. And to be part of communities and where you can be someone who's a visitor and really be able to ask questions and learn. That's really the only way that we start to see each other as human beings and not as others.
Can I, as we're putting, and just real quick, Shari, I apologize for interrupting. I am trying to put some great resources in the chat area. You see several of them that are coming up. If you have any further questions, I will also put my email available. So if you have specific resources that you're interested in, for example, the books that Dr. Berger has written, the articles that Dr. Chavis has written, and any other resources that you're really interested in, feel free to email me, and I'll be sure to put my email address in the book, and I'll share some additional resources with the group.
Or you can email me as well, just because they'll have my email address automatically from this program, and I can forward that on to you, Christie, or you can email it to me and I'll send it on to them. I was hoping, Dr. Charles Chavis, I don't want to interrupt you. Did you want to speak? Because
Yes.
Go ahead, and then I will kind of wrap it up. I'm going to ask you to put your last sort of 2 sentences together while I launch that poll, just because I want to do it.
Okay, no worries. So yeah, I'm just going to echo what Dr. Berger was saying. The anti-racism website that was created, being anti-racist by the Smithsonian African American History Museum, is so essential. And I think that would be a great resource. It also provides a reading list as well as diagrams that are easy to understand. And they've done an amazing job under the leadership of George Mason's own Dr. Spencer Crew. And so I would recommend that as a resource because the books that I could recommend it's too many to name, right? But I know that White Fragility is one that was mentioned, White Rage. And I'm also going to share my article with you all that have Christie share that was published in Southern Jewish History, a short biographical piece on Rabbi Israel that gives context about a lot of things that I spoke about. And I'm asking Christie to also put in some of the various discussions that we had in partnership with Busboys and Poets, where we raised a lot of these issues concerning the larger issues of race, as well as 2 pandemics that we're facing, COVID-19 and racism in this country. And so that's all going to be put in the chat. But thank you all so much, Shari, for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to be on this panel with you, Dr. Berger and Rabbi Saxe and Christie.
Quite welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This has been such a great discussion, and it's been an honor to be with both of you today. And thank you, Shari and Christie.
Oh, you're welcome, Dr. Berger. We've enjoyed having you at the JCC to teach, and we're hoping that we can do that again, maybe with the Bender JCC, since everything is virtual now. We're all in the same neighborhood. And Rabbi Saxe, there's been some questions I haven't had a chance to address with you if you want to look in the chat. A lot of them having to do with the Jewish community and how open it is to discussing racism, particularly in some sects of it, sects that you aren't necessarily affiliated with. Meaning more Orthodox as opposed to more Reform, and also how Jews of color may not feel as welcome as they should or could in the Jewish community. So there's a lot to really think about. The anti-Semitism and racism piece are really kind of neck and neck, because in some respects they are basically, though not the same, they're about oppression and hatred of people, just for a simple reason, whether it's because of the color of their skin or the religion they practice. And we need to find common ground in this day and age of epidemics, I think, and do more to support and help each other as God commands us to do.
Yeah.
Any last minute words?
Well, I did try to look on the chat and see those 2 categories of questions. In terms of indifference to racism and outright hostility towards African Americans among some in the Jewish community, especially in ultra-Orthodox communities. I would say, the question was, should we speak out more vociferously against that? The answer, I think, is yes, absolutely. We should speak out against all forms of racism, whether within our own communities or outside of them. Unfortunately, when we talk about relationships between different groups of Jews, I'm afraid that Reform Jews and Reform Jewish leaders don't have a heck of a lot of credibility with ultra-Orthodox circles. So there's a limit in how much effect we will have over their over actions within that community. And I don't want to paint them with too wide of a brush either. But that doesn't mean that we should not speak out and keep speaking out. And the other question I saw was about, or you mentioned, is the awareness within Jewish communities of the diversity within our communities. We have to work on that. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that this is something that we are looking at, from just having the awareness of knowing that when you walk up to somebody at an oneg in reception after a Friday evening service, who doesn't look like your conception of what you think a Jew usually looks like, that you should take a step back and remember that you need to remember that it's difficult for people who are part of Jewish communities who are different and look different. It's difficult for them to deal with questions all the time, and asking the first question that comes to your mind is maybe not the one that you should do, that you should ask. And that's just one example. But we need to work on our awareness that we want the Jewish community to reflect a full diversity of who America is. And we value and are excited about the fact that there are people in our communities that are not like Jews maybe looked 50 or 100 years ago. And we need to make sure that we open our minds up as quickly as the changes that might be happening within the Jewish community are occurring, so that we can benefit from that, and so that we can also treat everyone as they should be treated.
Yeah, America doesn't look like the way it used to.
Right.
That's going to be reflective in individual communities.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to launch the poll, and we'll see if anybody does actually respond, because this is my first webinar, and it's just one of those things that I thought would be great to have in the beginning and just forgot, because I got so excited about us addressing this topic, which seems to have had a lot of inspiring conversation around it. And I want to thank you all for being here, for devoting your time to making it happen and giving us your perspective from where you come from within this local community. It's great to have it. We've got so many great positive comments that have come. I hope you've been able to look at the chat and see it. I did record the program. I hope we can have that on our website so that folks that were not able to be here today can have an opportunity to hear the conversation, which may be a conversation starter in other realms as well. It was great working with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You all have a great day.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you soon. Stay well.